I have had many educators come to me and say, if you are not teaching in your classroom, what are you doing? And when I say to them, I am teaching, I'm just not lecturing, they look at me like I'm crazy. I am teaching. We are learning the basics outside of class so that we can get the deeper understanding and the deeper knowledge in class. A few ways that you can do this are allowing your students to explore the concept prior to the videos. I love to do a short exploration introductory task in class the day I assign a flipped lesson. I try to use this to connect the concept to something else that we've learned. Connect it to real life, to give it concept and meaning to the students, or just to introduce the concept and be sure there is no miscommunication about the deadline of the flipped lesson. Do not lecture again in class. We've talked about this in a previous video, but let's review it really quickly. However, do not lecture twice. When we use the flipped classroom method and then lecture in class, we are either wasting that class time or wasting student homework time to learn the basics. When you do both flipped lessons and lecture in class, you'll find a few things. First, students will stop completing the flipped lessons because they know that you will give them that same material in class. Second, you will have behavior problems during class lecture from students who did complete the flipped lessons because they already know this material and they're bored. Third, you will have less time to complete deep and transfer knowledge on the material since you are using homework and class time to complete the surface learning. If you're going to lecture in class, maybe a flipped classroom is not for you, and you'd be better off using a different teaching method in your class. Our class time is precious. Do not waste it doing the same thing twice. I know what you're thinking, but what if they don't understand? I have to lecture again. What I found was, first, often the students who don't understand did not complete the flipped material. Send them to complete the flipped material with their phones or a classroom computer. Have them use headphones for less disruptions. However, have an additional consequence. Lunchtime detention to complete the in-class portion worked well for me. Second, after class discussion, most students who didn't understand do, so use discourse to your advantage. Third, use classroom seating to your advantage. Place a student who often does not understand with a few who understand most of the time. They will pull this student up to their level. Also, do not place students who often do not complete their flipped classroom in the same group. The whole group may fall to their level. Place these students with their classmates who do complete the flipped lessons, and you should see improvement in the flipped lesson completion percent. Fourth, work in a small group with those students who still do not understand but did complete the flipped material. I like to use student-led discourse to check for understanding. After a flipped lesson, I like to start the discussion by asking, what did you learn in your flipped classroom last night? Or what questions do you have about the flipped classroom from last night? What do you feel like you don't understand about the flipped classroom from last night? We discuss. However, I do not answer these questions. I open them up to discussion to the class and even expect the students to answer their classmates' questions. This does a few things. It teaches students that their classmates are a good resource and can be used to enhance their learning. It opens up students to the possibility of having some of these discussions on Google Classroom or whatever site you use while they are at home completing their lesson. Although you need to explicitly teach this, and these discussions are a great way to introduce this strategy to students. It makes the students take ownership of their learning. It creates a student-centered learning environment and pushes the teacher to be less central in the classroom. This allows me to work more one-on-one with struggling students. It helps students become more articulate and specific when voicing their thinking and understanding, and it pushes students to use mathematical vocabulary. It also allows students to identify and correct any misconceptions they or their classmates may have, as well as allowing the teacher to do the same. Be cautious that this does not become a time to lecture or to relearn what they've learned in the flipped lesson. This is really, really easy to slip into. The day after a flipped lesson, reinforce the concept with meaningful practice, tasks, and activities. You will have to create what works for you and your students. This is what worked for me. The day after a flipped lesson, we would discuss, and then we would complete a task or a practice or an activity in their small groups. It depended on the day. Every educator will tell you that learning is active. This is especially true for math. Students cannot understand it without doing it. So practice is important in any math classroom, whether it's flipped or not. While they are working in their groups, I am walking around asking questions to help students clarify what they learned, working with a small group or one-on-one with a student, fixing misconceptions on this concept or on a past concept. Teach students that their classmates are a good resource for their own learning. We discussed this already in this video, so I won't get into it too deeply again, but I will say I observed a vast change in my students when they finally started using each other as a resource. They formed their own study groups and got together to do their flipped lessons. They had meaningful discussions on our Google Classroom or via text messages. They realized that their classmates are just as important, if not more important, than their teacher is. I do not have seating charts in my classroom every day. I want my students to sit with other students who they feel comfortable talking and discussing with, and not having a seating chart, having them choose their own seats really helps make these discussions happen. My classes are very loud. Very, very, very loud, and I love it. They are discussing and they're working together and they are really talking. And they're excited about the math. Of course, they talk about other things. They are middle schoolers. Sometimes I have to stop and remind them to get back to the math, but for the most part, they stick to the math and they help each other gain a deeper understanding through their discussions. I know you've heard me say this too much, but once again, find and do what works for your students and what works for you and what supports your students in being successful.